Yeah, so the thesis is written during the master's program for future communications officers, but it's grounded in linguistic, where I have my background. In other words, it combines the subjects of linguistics and communication. As a contribution to the opening of a Swedish Museum of Language, thank you. The study examines what a possible content in such a museum it could be. The museum would have opened this year, but the work is delayed of reasons you all know. The study shows how attitudes to language are affected by cultural factors, and that your identity is crucial for your attitude to language. What makes this study special is that it examines attitudes to language in a, for linguistic, new way, with a theory from the field of organizational management. But also, this study compares the language attitudes of the public with the language attitudes of experts. Previously, this has been examined separately, and comparisons have only been made between different studies. Yeah. There are museums of language in other countries, and the arguments for a Swedish Museum of Language could be that the Swedish society is undergoing major changes right now that are affecting the language through globalization, digitalization, and urbanization. This means, among other things, that the language situation is returning to what it looked like in Sweden in the era of great power, 1611 to 1721, where many different languages were spoken in Sweden, just like today. But also to show and use the collections of language and dialects that already exist in Sweden, but new descriptions of the current linguistic variation in Sweden is also needed. Society today places high demands on language skills, where literacy and reading comprehension is declining among young people in the EU, especially among boys. Therefore, the status of language as a concept needs to be raised and ensured. But to do that, there must be focused not just on language skills, but also on the knowledge of languages, like linguistics. Why compare the public and the experts' opinions about the Museum of Language? Surveys conducted about 20 years ago show that there is a gap between linguists and the public's attitude to language, where linguists take a tolerant attitude to language changes and to language in use, while the public does not. Prior to the construction of a Museum of Language, this gap needs to be explored in modern times. Therefore, these are the research questions posed in the thesis. What does the public want to see in a Museum of Language? What do different groups of the public find most interesting? What could make the public not want to visit a Museum of Language? What do language experts think a Museum of Language should contain? On what points do the public and the language experts share the same views? And on what points do they have different views? I begin with a short presentation of the theoretical framework in the study. Models for popular science communication, sense-making, and different views on communication. The Museum of Language will contain a number of popular science presentations. For popular science presentations, there are different models that requires different levels of commitment from the public. The three models discussed in the thesis are the deficit diffusion model, which assumes there's a lack of knowledge among the public, and therefore knowledge needs to be disseminated. This is the most dominant model. The dialogue model, which requires dialogue with the public, a higher level of commitment. The participation model, which requires the public's involvement, citizen science, for example. And this Ruick script I found in a private garden. I think it's a very nice example of the participation model. It says, add me on Facebook. That's it. These models can be related to different views on what communication means. There are two general approaches to communication. These pictures show that, the two approaches. Either as an objective transport of information from A to B, where everything can be either right or wrong, an essential view, or a subjective sharing process, where several perspectives become important, a social constructivist view. The deficit diffusion model can then be related to a view of communication as a transmission, the first variant, while the participation model can be related to the view of communication as a sense-making process, the second variant. The theoretical framework used in this study is based on the view of communication as a sense-making process, the second variant. The theory of sense-making has been used in an attempt to provide a new perspective on the involvement of the public in popular science. With the theory of sense-making, the focus shifts from knowledge to meaning and makes it possible to take social structures into account. This is the whole point of the thesis, and that's why it's yellow. And I had tried to show this with this picture. You can see my husband's grandfather has. You can see him in the reflection there. He has taken this picture. It hangs on his wall, he's an educated man. He's a former teacher and a religious man. And a few years ago, he asked my daughter to check her knowledge, and he said, "Do you know who this is?" And she said, "Yes, of course I know who this is. It's Dracula." And she didn't have the knowledge, but she could make sense of this picture, and everybody can make sense of this picture. But with this shift, you have to do this shift, because otherwise who should assess whether the public has received the right level of knowledge, and how could it be measured? There's a risk that completely wrong changes are made in the museum if you only assume that something is too difficult to understand. Maybe the content is excellent for the visitor to understand, but becomes uninteresting for completely different reasons. So, when we're faced with something we don't understand, a sense-making process is triggered to get a grip of the situation. For example, during a visit to a museum. There are 7 characteristics of the sense-making process. It's grounded in identity construction. This is the most central characteristic of sense-making. The sense-making process puts the individual in the center. Identity sets the framework for perception of reality, because identity is created through constant process in interaction with others and the environment. It's retrospective. It's only after something has happened that we can create meaning around the event. If our memories change, the meaning of what we remember would also change, as in nostalgia. It's inactive. Just as identity is created through an ongoing process, your surrounding environment is created by your own and others' actions. When you say something or act, something is created that can be noticed by others. Acting is a condition for sense-making, and making is the part of the concept sense-making. And it's social, which this picture is showing. Sense-making is a social process. Your interpretation of a message is affected by how others perceive it. For example, language is a social concept that occurs through agreement between people. It's ongoing. Sense-making is going on all the time. However, specific parts of the constant flow can be distinguished and puzzled into other contexts with other fragments, and thus make sense around specific events. It's focused on extracted cues. Cues can be reference, framework, or previous experience that generates sense-making. Consequences teach us what has previously been important to pay attention to. The cues is an expression or an event that makes these references or experience visible. To create common sense, it becomes important to see these cues that can be crucial to how your message is perceived. Like in the former picture with Jesus, not Dracula, the Gloria is the kind of cue that my daughter didn't see. It's driven by plausibility rather than accuracy. You don't need to know every detail to be able to get progress with a problem or a thought. You do it anyway, even if you don't know every detail. It's just going on. So, two factors that primarily trigger the sense-making process are ambiguity and uncertainty. If uncertainty arises about how to interpret a message in an exhibition, the visitor begins to make sense based on the cues that are available together with retrospective fragments. The fewer cues that leads to the intended message, the greater the significance of other characteristics of the sense-making process, identity and social aspects. This is important. If there is an ambition to reduce the gap between girls' and boys' attitudes to language and reading, this will be important to consider. Very short about the survey. The sample groups of the public had to respond in writing to a survey with various alternatives and optional free text comments, and the sample group of the language expert had to answer one question in a given context in writing via email. And I will just point out that this survey is done before the pandemic, so that might affect. The variables which the sample groups of the public are based on is gender, age, and level of education. So the groups are professionals active in the plumbing industry, employees within the Church of Sweden, and high school students. In each group there are 10 people, 5 women and 5 men. The expert sample group consists of 6 experts specialized in different fields of linguistics, 3 men and 3 women. But I will not reveal much more about them, just to keep their anonymity. So, to explain the results, I'm going to repeat the research questions one by one. The first and the second question: what does the public want to see in a museum of language? What do different groups from the public find most interesting? According to the survey, the categories written language and origin of language are male favorites, while language in the future and social side of the language are female favorites. The study indicates that the church response group is more oriented towards a female identity, while the plumbing professionals response group is more oriented towards male identity. But remember that there is 5 women and 5 men in every group, so the culture is crucial to this answer. And 3, what would make the public not want to visit a museum of language? Results of other studies indicating that male identity didn't include reading seems contradictory to the fact that men in this study show interest in in-depth study. But men in the survey appear to have a different relationship to text than women. Possibly, male reading practice is oriented around a certain type of text, in different views on books and text as essentialist compared to social constructivist. This could also explain why men prefer the category written language and women the category social side of the language. Several answers to what would make the public unwilling to visit concern the physical environment. Comments about toddlers and obtrusive stuff indicate that visitors must be allowed to walk around in the museum in peace and quiet. Oh, excuse me. Some high school students also wrote that they don't want to visit if the exhibition is only in or about Swedish. So physical design becomes something that affects the sense-making process around the content and not just the content itself. Thank you. One suggestion from a language expert was to have a linguist in place on certain occasions to answer questions or give lectures. It would differ from the kind of in-depth reading that could be available at the website, and perhaps even provide a special reason to visit. But it is important to consider what role the linguist should take on. Even though sense-making is a social process, which could excuse me.
Considering your problems right now,
yeah.
Also think about the time.
Yeah. They should think about the status, because through power aspects, a linguist, like a high status person, could threaten the visitor's identity, which in turn can complicate the sense-making process. I skip to next. What do language experts think a language museum should contain? The short answer is everything. The identity of language experts is crucial for their answers to the survey. Their answers are based on the traditional language subject categories, despite the fact that these are not mentioned in the email question. This becomes a dilemma because they want to show the extent of the language subject with the ambition to be comprehensive within each field, and with target audience ranging from children to special knowledge. Something that all experts want in the survey want to include is written language, several topics that can be linked to it, for example, writing systems and constructed languages that appear in famous movies. It's interesting to note that just as the public response group, the female language experts also mentioned the social side of the language, unlike the male respondents. On what points do the public and the language experts share the same views, and on what points do they have different views? Let's start with similarities. The results show that both the public and the language experts believe that the world's different languages should be included, especially through interactive exhibitions and do-it-yourself activities, but also to see a map and number of speakers and how they sound like. Previous surveys on language attitude show that Swedes don't seem to care much about other languages than Swedish and English. But this doesn't seem to apply when it comes to exhibitions. It becomes obvious from a sense-making perspective that the public is interested in speakers of other languages, since sense-making process is socially conditioned. The fact that there is an interest in other languages and their speakers is in line with one of the museum's aims, to make the linguistic change of today visible. The response from both public and expert groups indicates a conception of static roles. The experts as senders and the public as receivers. With the sense-making perspective to communication, there is also a possibility for the opposite. Since acting is a condition for sense-making, interactive stations could be both helpful and a tool for solid source of language research material for the purpose to get more information about the language variation today. But there's also differences. This is the last slide. The public attaches great importance to speakers of the language, while the experts focus on the language itself. One free text comment, for example, said that it would be great to be able to speak to a person from another country through screen and get a direct translation. This relates to the language of the future, which in total is one of the most popular categories with the public, but this category is hardly mentioned by the experts. The difference consists mainly in the different perspective, function-oriented or descriptive. In other words, the gap that was found 20 years ago still exists. The public's sense-making about application could possibly be explained by the fact that according to several different surveys, Swedes mainly have viewed the Swedish language as something functional, which also was a language policy slogan during the 20th century. So, when looking at language policy over time, it becomes clear how crucial it is for language development, who is in power, and it's also clear that ideological tendencies of different eras both affect language and attitudes to language. So, yeah, that's all.
Oh, thank you very much.